Welcome everyone to the Mexican Grand Prix 2025 weekend preview. And my word is this season turning into quite a generational one. I mean, a few weekends ago, you could easily argue that this was one of the worst championships in history. But now that Max Verstappen is properly in it after the events of last week, it's turned into one of the best in recent times if it continues on this way. So, to describe that, I think it's best. I can't really avoid the McLaren self-implosion, really. It's the main talking point. And I think this incident is actually quite telling of Oscar Piastri's mentality. Because if you rewatch the start, he gets a good launch against Lando Norris. But then he decides to go for a switchback, even though he could have tried to hang it around the outside. And I just feel like to me, it's showing he's kind of desperate to make it up because he knows he's losing ground. Because he could have even just slot him behind because he had a whole sprint race ahead of him to try and do something. But no, he goes for an incredibly risky switchback. And as you can see, it backfires on him massively. And fortunately for him, takes out Lando Norris. But if it didn't, well, that could have been his championship lead absolutely decimated. And the whole talk about repercussions, I don't want to go into that because it's just utterly ridiculous. But from this incident, I'd find it hard to like blame Oscar for taking out Lando. It was a risky move for himself, but it was just incredibly unfortunate that it took out Norris as well. Like, it wasn't like Singapore where Lando kind of overcooked it and hit his teammate as a result. Instead, Oscar had his own incident, and that unfortunately just took him into Lando in the nature of where it was. Between the two McLaren cars, there wasn't any sort of like interaction between those two other than just the unfortunate nature that Oscar spun off. But as a number one Aston Martin fan, it just pains me that we were this close to Fernando Alonso getting through on this and potentially getting a sprint podium. But no, he gets a rear puncture just as he's about to get through all of the carnage. It just happens every time. Like it's difficult not to lose hope, but 2026, Adrian Newey, we're going to be chilling. But naturally, you'd be like, oh, at least we've still got Lance Stroll in the race. And then he does this. I mean, I guess today, that day was just one of his days to turn into Pastor Maldonado. Like, it was a ridiculous dive bomb. I mean, it was over nothing as well. Like, I just don't get it. But you know, if one Aston Martin fails, he just wanted to make both of them fail equally, equality between the two, if you will. But beyond that, obviously, like I say, McLaren incident is the main thing. But as a consequence of that, Max Verstappen has just absolutely swept everyone. Like, not even close. And I think it is important to say that once Lando had got past Charles, he was actually borderline quicker, but you can't really analyze that too much because Max could have been managing the whole race. Like, we don't know to what extent he was managing. Like, of course, they're never going to admit what they were doing. So you don't really know what the true pace difference was. But I do think, like, that kind of drive from Max is the kind of thing that really will kind of put in that creeping demotivation from the McLaren drivers because it just looked so impervious the whole weekend. Like, you kind of knew he had it sorted when Charles Leclerc got into second place, and arguably the same with the sprint race, where as soon as Max got clear, and after George Russell's ridiculous dive bomb, which by the way, I don't know why not much more is getting talked about that. I know it's like I don't want the racing to turn into some sort of like really ruled thing where like you can't do much aggressively. But Russell had no control of his car. He locked up, he was going off the track. Verstappen had to go off the track. I really don't understand how that wasn't even like a penalty. Like he completely nearly took both drivers out. And I know the stewards' favorite thing is, well, we don't let the consequence of an incident really take weight in the penalty. But it's like it kind of does there because that move on a different day would have taken Max out and they would have definitely given a penalty for that. So I am a bit surprised that didn't get anything, but it made the race interesting, I suppose. But it just seems a bit odd that that wasn't really talked about. Um, but yeah, with this result, it obviously takes Max within 40 points of the McLaren drivers, and it's nervous times for them because like I'll get onto this in a future section, but it just didn't look good for McLaren the whole weekend, really. And I think qualifying is the main pointer of that. The fact that Max didn't need to set a second run in Q3 is pretty ominous. That they couldn't get within, well, they got within 3/10 of him, and it had that 2023 kind of vibe where maybe we're going back to that now that Red Bull is still bringing upgrades to the car. And honestly, I'm down for it because it at least makes it interesting. The McLaren drivers have barely done anything this whole season against each other, and it needed Max to get in the mix. And a pretty dominant result like this, well, it brings him right back into it. But the last thing of the weekend that, of course, should be talked about is the Williams podium. I mean, I'm sure most people like that. The crowd response certainly did when Sainz was doing his interview. But I think it needs to. It's an incredible job that Williams have gone from like 2021, 2022, and 2023, where that car was absolutely terrible. Like it had the whole gimmick of being fast in a straight line, and that's all it had going for it. It was just a backmarker team and didn't really do much. And now you've gone to 2025 in the same regulation set. Like they haven't had a reset of regulations, and they're now pretty consistently the best midfield team, or if not fighting for it at least. And I think that's really impressive because I know in this dirty air formula, you're kind of your track position kind of keeps you there. So the fact that he held off the Ferraris in the sprint race, but no, I think that's more telling on the regulations rather than the Williams pace. But it does kind of show that the Williams is close enough to Ferrari that he is able to negate their speed advantage with the effect of the dirty air slowing them down. So it's pretty incredible what Williams have got to. And I think the podium in Azerbaijan and the sprint podium here is kind of what they deserve because I think you could argue that Hulkenberg's podium and arguably Isaac's podium in Zandvoort, they were a bit luck induced in the actual race. Like Hulkenberg had an incredible strategy and it got him there. He wouldn't have got that result on pure pace. And kind of it's a bit closer with Isaac because he was comfortably fourth in that race because of the dirty air, but still comfortably fourth. Um, but inherently in front. So I don't know. I think the Williams ones are a bit more legit because they did actually have contenders right coming for them. In Azerbaijan, for example, Antonelli right behind. But yeah, it's good to see Williams being successful again. And considering they haven't brought upgrades in a while, you probably would think they might be a decent contender in 2026 because they also will have the Mercedes engine, which is being weighed up as potentially the best engine to have. So I think Williams are in a good place right now, and it'll be interesting to see what goes on. But of course, it goes without saying, we need to give a rawesome driver for the 2025 United States Grand Prix. And who else can it be other than Max Verstappen? I mean, seriously, uh, I think as I said, it was just a dominant drive. Like, what more do you want from him? He got the win in the sprint, he got both pole positions, he got the win in the main race. It's the perfect example of a flawless weekend, and it can be no one else other than Max. And the only exception I will give as an honourable mention is Charles Leclerc, because that Ferrari looked terrible in sprint qualifying. And the fact that he's managed to go on a contra strategy at the start of the race, hold up Lando Norris for like 20 laps ish, and finish a pretty comfortable P3 is really a testament to his driving because that Ferrari, it's so inconsistent and does look like such a hard car to manage in a race. I just think any sort of podium result for them towards the end of this year is nothing but impressive because that car just does not look nice. Uh, with Roman driver, there of course has to be the antithesis to that, being the extinct driver. And I mean, there's a few candidates, but I think the main poster one, which most people will go for, is of course Oscar Piastri. He just was slow, and you think certainly with Max Verstappen and his recent championships, I think the only race you can argue Max Verstappen was just straight up slow in was last year in Azerbaijan. But apart from that, he's always on the pace. Even if he's not winning pace, he's always like in the mix to some extent. But Oscar was just nowhere. And there wasn't really a reason behind it either. That's the worst part behind it. And I think if you're an Oscar Piastri fan, it is incredibly concerning because, like I said, that there was no actual problem, as far as we know, as to why he just was slower than both Ferraris and borderline the same pace as George Russell. It's not good. And if this continues into Mexico, which I'll talk about later, it's potentially looking like he might not even finish in the top three in the top two in the championship. Like he might get beaten by Lando and Max, which, considering the lead he's had at some points in the season, that is a pretty shocking drop in form. Pretty bad. And probably one that will be talked about in the future if it does happen. But now onto the main substance of this and the Mexico Grand Prix build up. And I'll be honest, this track is just it's one of those where in previous years it's a prime candidate snooze fest. Like I don't know. There were flashes of interesting parts in last year's race, for example. Max Verstappen just going on a absolute demolition derby. Um, but in general, it's just not a good track due to its altitude and the layout in accordance to that. Because the cars have to manage most of the race, right? Because everything's overheating. So naturally, they're not really able to push fully for most of the race. And then you just look at the circuit layout and you look at Sector 3, the stadium section, which Crofty always loves to be like, look how amazing this section is. And it is cool as a fan. But for racing, it is the worst kind of section you could have to set up the long back straights. Like, especially in this dirty air formula, I will be surprised unless there's a tire delta or a significant pace offset. I will be surprised if a car is able to stay anywhere close throughout that section without just losing. time because it's just so hard to follow through there. It's and let alone making an overtake. And Sector 2 is all right. I think the straight into turn 4 is arguably the best part of the track, and that sequence into 5 and 6 where you can get some nice little battles there, and we have seen it in the past um with like um Hamilton and Ricardo in 2023 for example. But in general, it's just like Sector 1 has no identity because it's a straight line. Sector 2 is average, and then Sector 3 is just straight up bad. And it's kind of reflected in the previous races where it's just a bit of a dud of it. And you have to remember last year where Carlos Sainz had a incredible weekend as a whole. Like he looked really ominously like good to win that race, and of course he did go on to win that race. But I think not only there's two takeaways from this. I think this weekend you should keep an eye on Ferrari, even though they have changed the car completely from last season. They Ferrari have historically run quite well at this track. I don't know why, but they just do. Um, so I'd keep an eye on Ferrari, especially, of course, Charles Leclerc, because Lewis Hamilton's not particularly in the best of forms right now. But beyond Ferrari, I think McLaren also need to be quite um, worried about, in particular with Lando Norris, because in most recent years, Lando Norris has been a menace at this track. I mean, last year he was very close to taking the win. Like, if he was definitely the fastest car, I think, is fair to say, especially towards the latter end of the race. And if it had more laps, I think Lando would have won that race. But also in previous years, where there was that year where he was just stuck. He qualified really low down, had a great start. Then there was a red flag, I think, it's of Magnussen having a car failure into the wall. And then Lando had a terrible restart, but recovered himself way up into the points and beat Piastri, I think. And he's just really good at this track. And I think it is something for the context of this championship fight. It is certainly something to look out for because, in terms of Lando Norris tracks, I would class Mexico as one of them. So it should make this weekend pretty interesting. Um, but of course, as well as that, last year, Max Verstappen going crazy. To be honest, I don't know if we'll see the same sort of levels as this because I think the points deficit was actually bigger when this happened last year. So, like, Max was like this with more of a gap, which could argue that he might do something desperate like this if he does need to. But it was kind of ridiculous last year. I think the turn four incident, it was bad, but I think it's the this incident right here that was the terrible one. I mean, he just sent it with no intention of letting Lando back on the track, but you know, it was entertaining at least. This is what you want to see from a championship battle, and I really hope this continues in the last races because even though it is dirty driving, it at least gives the race some sort of substance. It gives it a context where, like, now Lando Norris being behind, he's going to be more aggressive with Max on the next move. It's just more interesting if things like this happen. And even though maybe moves like this are bad, I do think it would be nice to see more aggression from the McLaren drivers. Because you have to think, if Oscar qualifies up here and is slower on pace than Max, then he needs to defend his life out because any more points losses to Max or Lando, and Piastri is then going to be in a really shaky spot in the championship. Um, which is also notable because with the turn one at this track, I think it's very likely that one of the top three in the championship gets involved in some sort of incident here, just like we saw in Kota. Uh, because it's just the nature of the corner, like especially when you've got the top three, like the top three on the grid, all having the ambition of coming out of that corner first. They go for moves that probably, in hindsight, aren't calculated enough, and it just leads to this sort of bottleneck where there's not enough space, and it ends up in a collision, like we saw in 2021, 2023, and 2024. Like, it's quite likely, I'd say, that we'll see some sort of incident. Maybe not with the top three in the championship, but if Oscar qualifies high up and he gets a bad run into this corner, I do think it is possible that he goes for some sort of lunge or desperate move to try and keep the position and then results in contact. So I think if you're a fan of any of the top three in a championship, this first corner is going to be something you should be worried about because it's arguably the last sort of spot in the rest of the championship where you'd probably expect an incident to happen, just because of the nature of the circuit. So if your favorite gets out of this corner, I think you should be very happy with that because it's it causes a lot of chaos. But now, you also need to talk about the gap between Max and Oscar. And of course, it doesn't get talked about enough, but Lando and Oscar, because that's even closer at 14 points. And into this weekend, it is definitely the momentum with Max and Lando. There's no question behind that. And I think it will make it very interesting dynamically with how Oscar responds to that. Because realistically, he has been lacking pace in the last few weekends. And historically at this circuit, Oscar hasn't been very good. He really hasn't. Um, no one really knows why, but he just Lando's had his mark every time, the two times we've come to this track. And of course, it goes without saying, Max is incredibly good at this track, with I believe 5 wins here, the most of anybody. Um, so I think it's reasonable to expect one of these gaps to decrease this weekend. I think potentially both. I do believe that Max and Lando probably will be faster than Oscar, and thus the points will reduce. But all I think the main takeaway from this is Oscar needs to do his best to finish P3 at the minimum. Like if he's losing 10 points to Lando, he still keeps his championship lead. If he loses 10 points to Max, yes, it's a 30-point gap, but at least he's still got races to find format. But I just think this track is one that kind of he needs to discount, try and get the maximum out of what he can do. But I just don't see it being an Oscar Piastri track, in my opinion. So that will lead on to my top five qualifying predictions, which I think it's quite easy to get the sort of top five these days because it is quite clear which drivers are on form. So in fifth place, I've gone for George Russell. In fourth, Oscar Piastri. Third, Charles Leclerc. Second, Lando Norris. And in first place, to the surprise of not many people, Max Verstappen. And I think this is quite a reasonable top five. It's very similar to the top five we had in Kota. And the reason why I believe this is because my prediction is Lando Norris will be the fastest driver in qualifying, but he'll bottle his final run and Max will take it. That's my prediction. And then Oscar will just be slightly off the pace in fourth. And Charles Leclerc will slot into that gap between him and Lando. But more interestingly, leading into the top five race predictions, possibly a curveball to many people, I've gone for Alex Albon in fifth. I think the Williams will be pretty decent this weekend, and as you'll see in the rest of my top five, there is a reason for him being here. So in fourth, I have Lewis Hamilton. third, George Russell, second, Lando Norris, and in first, Max will go from pole to victory. And to the keen observers here, you'll see that Charles Leclerc and Oscar Piastri are missing. And that's because I believe with Charles Leclerc qualifying ahead of Oscar, I think Oscar will get a run on Charles into turn one, and they'll have some sort of contact, and both of them will get damage or DNF from turn one. And that, of course, will let George, Lewis, and Albon inherit those positions. So, quite a spicy one, I'd say. But I can see it happening. I really do. I think, like I said earlier, with the sort of desperate move Oscar did in the sprint race at Kota, I foresee that happening again here, where he knows he needs to get into the top three to stick with Lando and Max, but then he just overcooks it and takes himself and Charles with damage or out of the race. So that's my top five. Arguably quite a spicy one. Um, but on to the most exciting segment of the entire weekend and every weekend is a Lance Stroll of the week, where we predict whether he'll be prime Ayrton Senna or revert to the primitive state of Pastor Maldonado. And my prediction this week is he'll have a very, very, very mediocre P16 qualifying. He'll start 16th on the grid, and then you'll just get that sort of casual Lance Stroll race where he'll end up in 10th. And I think it's what we see quite a lot with Lance, pretty mediocre qualifying, somehow appears in the top 10 in the race. Nobody knows what dark magic he uses to do that, but he does it. And I think we'll just see a nice little point for Lance Stroll this weekend, even though Aston Martin historically have been quite bad at this track recently, which pains me. Um, but I have hope. I have hope. Probably misplaced, but we'll see. Hopefully a 10th place for Lance Stroll. And then for my crazy, well, not crazy, but my general prediction of this week is going to be that there's four DNFs in this race. And you could say that's going to be Oscar and Charles from my previous prediction. I'm not going to predict each driver because that's just a losing battle for me. There's no need for me to make this a tighter prediction. But I think four DNFs, I think some of those will be at turn one. And I think it should make the race somewhat interesting if there are some DNFs. And we have the tyre step as well, between I think the hard tyre and then the medium and the soft together. I personally don't see that doing much, uh, but hopefully it does. So I think DNFs will be needed for this race to be somewhat interesting. Otherwise, I I fear it's going to be a boring. Everyone's at a sort of like 5 second gap to each other, and not much happens for the rest of the race, and the leader just drives off into the distance. But let's hope it's actually a good race for once. And that's all I have to say for the build up to the 2025 Mexico Grand Prix. I think if hopefully this race is a good one, it has everything stacked up for it to be a good one, except for the fact that the track is quite a bad one. Um, but in the narrative of the championship, everything's there, everything's to play for. And if there is some sort of incident with the championship leader, I think this will be a very pivotal race in the championship, especially if Lando or Max end up winning this one. So, thank you very much for watching. I will be back for the Brazilian Grand Prix in 2 weeks' time. I think this will go out a little late, so please forgive me for that. But I hope we all enjoy the race, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.